My name is Nate. There we go. Good. Sorry, this is my first Sunday. I'm the lead pastor here, believe it or not, and this is the fifth part of our series called Feast. And as I prepared this week, these movies were brought to mind. I think some of the best movies are the kind that are taking you one way for the entirety of the plot, and then at the end there's this line or a thing or a scene, and it twists everything on its head, and you realize, oh my goodness, there's this plot twist at the end that makes you want to go back and rewatch the whole movie. I think maybe the most famous example of this is probably Sixth Sense from way back. It's probably in the 90s, okay? If you haven't watched that yet, it's been like 30 years, so spoiler alert. I don't feel bad for you that I'm about to ruin this. But what happens in the movie is there's this young guy. I don't know who the actor is. And then there's another guy played by Bruce Willis, right? And they're buddies in the movie. And they're telling you a story, and there's some interactions, and the world kind of interacts with Bruce Willis's character a little bit differently than the young child interacts with the character. There's somebody that he's in love with, and she won't really give him the time of day, and there's something going on there, but you don't quite know what it is, and you're really wrapped up in the story because it's very well written. And then at the end of the movie, the little boy utters his famous line from the movie that you know, right? I see dead people. Yeah? And then the back of your head just blows off right against the wall, and you think, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense now. And then you flash back through all these scenes that now make sense, and all the other interactions that this boy seems to have with the other characters that are a little bit different than everybody else. And all of a sudden, like, it's just this oh my goodness moment where you realize, and all you want to do is rewind and watch it again, or for the millennials, you just want to hit restart and watch it again all the way through, because now you know this kid is seeing dead people, and the whole movie takes on a different color for you, right? I love movies like that. And so this week, as I was studying the festival for this week called the Feast of Firstfruits, I kind of had one of these moments where in my studies I realized, oh my goodness, I think I see what's going on here with all these festivals. So like I said earlier, this is the fifth part of our series called Feast, where we've been looking at the holidays that God himself instilled in the Jewish calendar in the Old Testament. Every week we've been seeing that they point to Jesus, that they paint a little bit different picture, and this week we're going to have the opportunity to kind of go back through them. So if you haven't been in a little while, this is a great catch-up Sunday. If you have been here for every one of them, because man, you love festivals, then this will be a good chance to see if you've been paying attention and you actually know what's been going on. So everybody wins. But this week we're looking at the Feast of Firstfruits. And when you first approach it, as I began to research it, I grabbed the books that I've been using and started to see what smarter people than me have to say about it. I really expected it to be a sermon and a festival focused on the idea of stewardship. Stewardship is this idea that everything that we have is God's. All that we have belongs to God, our time, our money, our resources, even our family, our relationships, our abilities, everything that we have really is God's. And so stewardship acknowledges, God, everything I have is yours. I'm simply a steward of the things that you've given me, and I'm to leverage them for you and for your kingdom. That's what stewardship is. And I thought that this is what First Fruits was going to be. And it is a little bit. We'll talk about it. We'll just kind of stop and highlight something that's worth saying and then move on. But as I studied, I realized, man, that's really not what God was going for here. And I kind of had this moment where everything kind of tied together for me, and I want you to have that too. It's not as good as Sixth Sense. I mean, maybe one of the dumbest things to do is to start with a Sixth Sense example and then promise to deliver on that amount of drama. Okay, let's lower the expectations. That will not happen, but I think that we will tie it together in a way that's really helpful. So First Fruits falls on the heels of Passover. Last week we talked about Passover, the festival of Passover, which celebrates the 10th plague in Egypt when God freed his people from slavery to the Egyptians and Pharaoh finally let his people go. There was an angel of death that moved over the nation of Egypt, and if you had the blood of a spotless lamb on your doorframe, presumably in the shape of a cross, and the angel would pass over your home and your firstborn would not would not be taken because the lamb had died the death that the sin demanded. And so the lamb is the provision for the people, and it's a picture of Jesus being the provision. That's what we talked about with Passover last week. And it's so interesting to me that Passover is what Jesus was celebrating thousands of years later, the night that he was arrested. And Passover historically begins on a Friday night. It's the beginning of the Sabbath. Sabbath starts about 6 p.m. at dusk when it begins to get dark. That's the Sabbath. And so it starts Friday night. That's when you have your Passover meal. And so first fruits falls on the Sunday after Passover Friday, after Passover Sabbath. So you have Passover Friday, then you have the Sabbath, and Saturday you wait, and then Sunday you celebrate the Feast of the Firstfruits. And the way that this was done is the farmers would go out and they would get their springtime harvest. Most of the time it was wheat. They would go out into their field and they would take the first and the best stalk of wheat, the most ripe piece of wheat. I don't know anything about wheat farming. You're going to see a lot of ignorance in the next 3 minutes, but I think we can all move through it together and understand what's happening here. So you go out into your field and you'd get the best looking bit of wheat and you would take that to the high priest. And then the high priest would burn your wheat along with everyone else's and wave it to the Lord, and the smoke would rise off of the wheat as prayers to the Lord, and the prayer was for the rest of the harvest, and really the sacrifice was so that the rest of the harvest would be acceptable to the Lord. That's what's happening at the Feast of Firstfruits. And there's an element of faith here that we may not realize, because to walk out into your field that you've painstakingly worked in for months and take the first bit of this harvest that you're going to need for your family for the rest of the year, either to eat on or to live off of by selling or trading. And you take the first bit of it, the very first, the best looking stalk of wheat there, and you grab that together and you take that into the high priest. That requires some faith. Because you don't know how the rest of that harvest is going to go. They're not going to all ripen and be ready at the same time. There's days or weeks of harvesting yet in front of you, so you don't know how it's going to go. There could be a frost that night that could ruin the rest of your crop. So it really takes a bit of faith to take your first and your best to God in this instance. And I think that when we think of farms, because the only farms we see in America are these huge monolithic farms with hundreds and hundreds of acres and like a bunch of wheat. I don't know how to quantify wheat. Thousands of wheats. I don't know what you say. Bushels. There's a lot of it. And so we think to take a little bit of that and carry it over to the church or to the high priest isn't really that big of a deal. But what about the guy who is farming by hand on his acre lot or his quarter acre lot, and he's just got this little field, and that wheat has to last, and he needs every last bit of it? What about that family? What about the ones that really need this crop this year? It takes a lot of faith to pick the first and the best and to go and to carry that to God. And that part I do think is about stewardship. And I think it is worth pausing, kind of coming over here. This is not helpful in the sermon proper, but this is a helpful point to make. There's a good lesson in first fruits. Because what would make the most sense is to harvest it all and then take what you could afford to God, right? And this is typically how we approach life. Listen, I'm not supposed to say this because I'm the pastor, and we all give our 10% or whatever we're compelled to give. I 100% giving, I know, for sure. There are some months when things are tight, and I know what I'm supposed to give, but you know what I do? Please don't tell other churches. I wait to the end of the month. Make sure I can afford it. That's not the idea with giving. It's not right with me to do that. We give at the beginning. We give our first. We budget on the rest. But we have a tendency to do this, don't we? With our time, with our energy, with our money, with whatever it is, we kind of invest it in our life. We make sure we're good. We get the whole harvest. And then the parts we can afford, we take and we offer to the Lord, so that in some ways he gets the fringes or the leftovers. And First Fruits tells us, no. We offer our time and our resources to God first, and then we allow him to orchestrate the rest. But that's stewardship, and that's what we see. And it seems like, as you study through it, that this really is a lesson, a reminder that, hey, all the harvest is God's, and He's going to provide if we're faithful, right? But the more I read about it, the more I realized that's really not what God is getting at. Because one of the authors pointed me in the direction of this verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20. You can open there if you want. The verse will be on the screen. It's this curious verse, and Paul, the author of Corinthians, writes this. He says in verse 20, "But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep." In fact, Christ has been raised from the dead, the firstfruits of those who have fallen asleep. Now listen, I'm one who believes that words are not in the Bible on accident. And Paul knew that there was a Jewish audience here in the church in Corinth, and they would know what that meant. That when you say firstfruits, the Jewish mind jumps back to the festival of firstfruits and acknowledges what it means, where you take the first of the crop and you offer it to the Lord, and that crop makes the rest of the harvest acceptable. And then things start firing off in, as Doug so eloquently put it, our dim-witted little brains. And I realized, oh my goodness, firstfruits is a picture of Jesus. Firstfruits follows on the heels of Passover. Passover, the lamb dies. Then he's in the grave on Saturday. Then on Sunday, when firstfruits is celebrated, when it has been for thousands of years, Jesus rises from the dead. This is why we celebrate Easter on Sunday in the spring. He rises from the dead on a Sunday, and he offers himself to God as the high priest. He goes to God on our behalf, and he presents himself as the first fruits of the harvest that is to come. And then I realized, oh my goodness, there's all this harvest language all over the Bible. We're told that God is the Lord of the harvest. And that doesn't just mean the physical harvest that's too small. We're not trusting him for those crops. It means the harvest of souls to heaven. It means the things that are to come. If you're a believer, then one of the things you cling to is the hope of what we call the rapture. When one day Jesus comes down in the clouds, as is talked about in Corinthians, and the trumpet sounds, and the workers are called in from the harvest, and the harvest of souls is gathered to heaven. That's what it is when we go to heaven together. It's the harvest. And Jesus, when he dies, goes to God as the high priest, and he presents himself as the first fruits of the harvest that is to come. It's not about stewardship. It's a picture pointing to Jesus. And then I started to realize in this festival of the first fruits are all these different pictures of Jesus that have already been painted by the other festivals. And I started to realize that in first fruits, we have this tremendous picture of who Jesus is as he's presented by all the other festivals that we've already gone through, by all the other festivals that God has had his people go through every year. And I started to realize these are all tied together and brought together in the Feast of Firstfruits. I remember that the very first one we celebrated, the Feast of Trumpets, as we started off our new year, we had one of our great partners, Brandon Reese, come up here, and he sounded the shofar at the beginning of the service, as they did to inaugurate the new year. And what we learned is what I've just talked about, that one day when Jesus comes to call the workers in from the harvest, to gather the harvest, that he is going to sound the trumpet. And so in the Feast of Trumpets, we see a picture of Jesus as sounding the trumpet. And then the very next week, we came back and we looked at the Feast of Atonement, or the Day of Atonement. The day when sacrifices were made to make Israel right with God. And we looked at the grandeur and the majesty around the ceremonies at the temple performed by the high priest, with the high priest really the focal point of all of Israel that day, with his duties and everything that he had to do. And one of the things that we carried out of that is this picture of Jesus as the high priest. Next week, we came back and we did tents, the Feast of Tents. We set a big one up out there. We all ate under the tent. It was the hootenanny. It was a great Sunday. And that was a reminder to the Hebrew people that their ancestors had lived in the desert for 40 years and lived in those tents. And every day when they walked outside, God had provided for them this thing called manna. And what tents does is gives us a picture of Jesus as God's provision. After that, last week, we looked at Passover. And the picture of Passover, I've already told you, was very clear. That lamb died so that people in that home didn't have to. And when Jesus shows up later, John the Baptist looks at him and he says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world." And so in Passover, we have a picture of Jesus as the lamb. And then this week, Firstfruits. Seems like it's just about stewardship and resources. But what we understand based on what Paul says is that Jesus is our firstfruits, that he makes us acceptable to God. And so it's a picture of Jesus as the firstfruits. And as I'm seeing all these different pictures kind of fire off in my head, I kind of have that moment where I tie it all together and I realize this, that firstfruits shows us Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away our sin, the high priest who offers that lamb as a provision for our sin, and the first fruits of the harvest begun at the sounding of the trumpet. And in that sentence there, we see how firstfruits brings together everything, all the different pictures of Jesus that we've been looking at for 5 weeks, all the different pictures of Jesus that they acknowledge through their celebration and through their culture throughout the year. When you get to firstfruits, they're all tied together in this tapestry that God has woven. And what I realized is they believed. The Hebrew people that God instructed, hey, every year I want you to acknowledge these things. I want you to do these ceremonies, and I want you to celebrate these things, and I want you to remember what I've done for you. Every year they got together and they faithfully went through the holidays and the celebrations, and they believed that they were celebrating their past, but they were really pointing to their future. They believed they were celebrating what God had done in the past, the provision that he was, the lambs that came in the past, the time that we celebrated in Egypt and the rescue of God that came then. But really what they're doing is they're pointing to what's to come. They're pointing to Jesus. And it just blows my mind that tucked away in this often ignored book of Leviticus, in the 23rd chapter, are the details quickly for these 6 festivals that God wants his people to honor every year. And if you were to take the details of those and look at them and then lay the picture of Jesus over top of them, what you would find is a beautifully woven tapestry that God created over the course of history to point to his Son and his love for us, to point to his plan. It's amazing to me. You know, a couple weeks ago, I went to a thing called a preaching school, which I understand will set off dozens of jokes in your head, and you feel free to make them. I'm going to skip right over them and just assume that you're making fun of me in your head and you know, well, can't tell and things like that. But I went to like a preaching intensive. I wanted to just kind of sharpen the tool and the skill of preaching. I've got a long way to go, but one of the things that they told us that happens in a good sermon is that a skilled pastor, he or she, will drop in bits throughout the sermon that help it make sense when you get to the conclusion. That if I'm doing a good job, I will say words and phrases all throughout the sermon, drop them in at different places so that when I finally say the conclusion at the end, it just ties it all up together in a nice, neat little bow. You just kind of plan and drop things in all along the way to help to prepare you guys to kind of till the soil to be ready for the conclusion. And just so we're clear, that's not happening today. I'm not doing that. Because I sat there and I thought, my gosh, that's so hard. That's so hard to do that every week. I have to do one of these every week. This morning, this one was squared away. I thought, okay, good, I'm fine. I think I can preach that one. And then immediately, what's next week? I will drive home thinking about next week's sermon. I really will. It's the nature of the beast. I don't have time every week to orchestrate little things to drop in for you guys. You kidding me? I'm not that good. I think I've done that like 3 times since I've gotten to Grace. I'm so sorry. And I'm sitting in there in that class going, that would be great. How do you do that? Listen, I struggled to do that over the course of 30 minutes. God has woven history together like that. He has dropped in little things over history, little signposts every year to prepare us for the coming of his Son, for the conclusion of his promises. God made Abraham some promises in Genesis 12. And then he enacted this grand plan to bring about his Son, to save us, to reunite us with our Creator. And if it wasn't enough just to enact that plan, he told his people in Leviticus, in this often neglected book tucked away in the Bible, in the 23rd chapter, he says, every year I want you to celebrate these 6 things. And they thought those 6 things were a celebration of their past, but they were pointing to their future. Every year when they celebrated Passover, they were celebrating the provision that Jesus would be. Every year when they offered their first fruits, they were painting a picture of who Jesus would be. Every year when they watched the high priest perform the sacrifices, they were staring at who Jesus would be. It's funny to me that we hear people say, you know, if God is real, why doesn't he make himself more evident? Y'all, he got his people to celebrate things 6 times a year that pointed to his Son. What more do you want him to do? He wove Jesus into all of history. And when I look at that and the way that it all comes together in this beautiful picture, I marvel at the sovereignty of God, at his power and efficacy at weaving together history to prepare us to till the soil for the arrival of his Son at the perfect time. And now as we sit and we wait for the return of his Son, when the trumpet sounds and he calls in the harvest, what is he weaving together now that we don't even know about? When I look at the tapestry that he's made with just his festivals, I marvel at God's sovereignty. And it reminds me of a place that I love. I've told you guys about this place before, but I think it bears repeating. My in-laws used to own a lake house down in Georgia on Lake Oconee. And we would spend a lot of weekends there. Jen and I were older, we were married, we were in our late 20s, and Jen's sister was still in college, and so most weekends we got invited over there, but when we would go, Jen's sister, her name's Lauren, she's immensely likable and charming, and so she was like a Pied Piper, and all these people are coming with her, all these college kids, right? And they're like on the wakeboard, and they're ripped out of their mind, and they look like Greek gods, and they're like, Nate, do you want to go? And I'm like, no, I'm going to keep my shirt on. I think I'm good. They're like doing flips and stuff. I'm like, would you like to embarrass yourself and wreck in front of everyone? Like, I'm squared away. So one of my favorite things to do amidst all these college kids and all the noise and everything else, there was about probably 40 yards between the back of their house and the lakefront. And right in front of the lake was this hammock. And one of my favorite things to do was just to wander down by myself. Some of you who know me well will be shocked to hear that. And get into the hammock and just rest. Because in that hammock, I can almost put myself there now. All the noise and all the kids from college that faded. Everything going on in my life. All the things that I had rushed in there, just coming in on 2 wheels after a busy week, thinking about what's coming up next. All that faded. And I could just see the sky. I could hear the breeze going through the trees. And I could hear the water lapping up against that retainage wall right there. And it was peaceful. And I could just rest because everything was quiet. And to me, that will forever be a picture of what it is to rest in God's sovereignty. To simply rest in the sovereignty of God. And to know, if he can do this with history, certainly he can do that with my story. If he can weave together history to point to his Son, to prepare us for him, and then orchestrate our lives in such a way that everything in us claws for Jesus and for peace with our Creator, if he can orchestrate everything in that way, then he can handle my story too. If he can orchestrate all of this, then the things that are stressing me out, the things that are making me anxious, the things that make me feel uncertain or unclear or in pain, God can work that out too. And it makes me wonder if for all those years God was weaving this picture to point to his son and the people around it didn't even know. They didn't even realize what they were doing or really celebrating. What are the things that we're pointing to that we don't even understand yet? What are the things that when we get to heaven, we're going to look back on this life and we're going to go, oh, wow. What are those moments that we're going to have? So as I think about the festivals and what they point us to, and God's sovereignty as he orchestrates them, it just makes me want to rest easy in it. And know that if God can do all that with history, then he can do that with my story. And it makes me want to trust him. Rest easy in that. And I hope that you will too. I hope that whatever's going on in your life, whatever you came in on 2 wheels thinking about, whatever you're rushing to after this, know that if God can orchestrate all of history, if he can organize those 6 festivals to point to him and his rescue every year, he can handle whatever's happening with you too. And maybe today we can just rest easy in that. And we can trust that. In a minute, we get to sing a song together after we take communion. And we're going to say, take my whole world, everything in it. I think that when we sing that, it should have special meaning. God, I trust it to you. If you can weave this, then I trust you with me. Let's pray, and then we'll celebrate communion together. Father, you're good to us. We marvel at how you organize history. We marvel at all the different signposts, at all the different symbols that you give us all throughout history, all along the way to point to yourself, to point to your son, to point to how you love us. God, I pray that we would rest easy in your sovereignty. That we would quit believing that we can somehow control the uncontrollable. That we would acknowledge that it's all in your hands. That you would give us a peaceful rest in our trust in you. And that we would watch you come through even today, even this week. Thank you for the pictures that you paint with the festivals that you initiated. I pray that we would see them more and more clearly. It's in your son's name we pray. Amen.